The crumbling towers of Castle Dracul pierced the Carpathian mist like accusatory fingers, their weathered stone surfaces stained dark with centuries of secrets that refused to be washed away by mountain rains, even now, for 100 years after. The last scream echoed through these corridors. Visitors speak of hearing whispers in the wind that sweeps through the broken windows, of catching glimpses of pale figures in the shadows that dance between the ruins. The locals cross themselves when they pass the overgrown path that once led to the castle gates, and children dare not venture near the crumbling walls where wild roses have grown thick and blood red, as if the earth itself remembers what transpired. Within these stones, this is where Countess Vladana Dracul lived, loved, and descended into a madness so profound that it would echo through history as one of humanity's darkest chapters. Born in 1571 into the most powerful noble family in Transylvania, Vladana entered a world where birth determined destiny, where the accident of bloodline granted absolute power over hundreds of souls, and where the line between civilization and barbarism was as thin as morning mist over these same mountains. The Dracul lineage stretched back through centuries of warfare, political intrigue, and whispered connections to the supernatural. They were dragon slayers and kingmakers, warriors who had held back Ottoman invasions, and nobles who had shaped the fate of Eastern Europe through blood and cunning. But this legacy came with a price written into the very foundations of their castle. The family tree was twisted by generations of strategic marriages between cousins, concentrating wealth and power while also concentrating the seeds of madness that lay dormant in their bloodline. Young Vladana grew up in corridors lined with portraits of ancestors, whose eyes seemed to follow her movements, whose painted smiles held secrets that would only reveal themselves as she matured. Her childhood was spent in luxury that few could imagine, surrounded by servants who existed solely to fulfill her wishes, educated by tutors who traveled from distant universities to share their knowledge with the daughter of such an influential house. She spoke 5 languages fluently, could discuss philosophy with visiting scholars, and carried herself with the natural authority of someone who had never been denied anything she desired. Yet beneath this privileged existence, darker lessons were being absorbed. At age 10, she witnessed her first execution when her father ordered a peasant hang for stealing bread from the castle stores. What struck young observers was not the execution itself, common enough in those times, but Vladana's reaction to it. While other children looked away or wept, she watched with intense fascination, studying the man's face as life drained from his eyes, asking her governess detailed questions about the physical process of death that made the older woman uncomfortable. Her education and cruelty continued through the casual violence that permeated noble life. Servants who displeased were beaten as a matter of course. Peasants who fell behind on their obligations were imprisoned in the castle dungeons. The difference between Vladana and her peers was not exposure to such brutality, but her apparent enjoyment of it. She began volunteering to witness punishments, then suggesting harsher penalties for minor infractions, displaying a calculating coldness that concerned even her hardened father. At 15, Vladana was married to Count Dmitry Raven, a military commander known throughout the region for his tactical brilliance and his ruthless efficiency in dealing with enemies. The marriage was arranged to unite two powerful houses, but it proved to be more than a political alliance. Dmitry recognized in his young bride a kindred spirit, someone who shared his appreciation for the more extreme aspects of power. During their honeymoon, he introduced her to techniques of interrogation he had learned during his military campaigns, methods that could extract information while causing maximum suffering. The couple's private chambers became a laboratory of cruelty where they experimented on servants who had committed minor transgressions. Vladana proved an eager student, displaying a natural aptitude for causing pain that impressed even her experienced husband. She learned to read the subtle signs of approaching death, how to keep victims conscious through the worst torments, and most importantly, how the infliction of suffering could become as addictive as any drug. For the first years of their marriage, the killings were sporadic and carefully concealed. A servant girl who broke expensive pottery might be found dead in her quarters, apparently from a fall, A stable boy who spoke disrespectfully might disappear entirely. His absence explained as voluntary departure to seek work elsewhere. The pattern was subtle enough that no official notice was taken, and the power of the Dracul name ensured that uncomfortable questions were rarely asked. Everything changed when Dmitri died in 1598, officially from fever contracted during a military campaign, though some whispered that even he had eventually grown uncomfortable with his wife's increasingly extreme appetites. At 27, Vladana inherited vast estates, enormous wealth, and most importantly, complete autonomy over her lands and the people who lived on them. For the first time in her life, she answered to no one but herself. The transformation from occasional killer to systematic murderer began with vanity. Vladana had always been considered beautiful, with the pale skin and dark hair that were prized among the nobility. But approaching 30, she began to notice the first subtle signs of aging that would consume her thoughts and ultimately drive her to unprecedented acts of horror. The discovery that would change everything happened almost by accident when a young servant girl named Anya was helping her mistress prepare for bed. As Anya carefully brushed Vladana's hair, a knot caught and pulled painfully. In a moment of rage, Vladana struck the girl across the face with such force that her ring opened a deep cut. Across the servant's cheek, blood splattered across Vladana's hand, and as she wiped it away, she noticed something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The skin where the blood had touched appeared somehow different, smoother and more youthful, as if the years had been washed away by that crimson stain. Whether this transformation was real or imagined hardly mattered. Vladana believed it completely, and that belief became the foundation of a delusion that would drive her to commit acts of savage cruelty beyond imagination. She began with small experiments, pricking servants with pins and applying their blood to her face like cosmetic paint, studying her reflection for hours to detect any change in her appearance. As months passed, Vladana became convinced that larger quantities of blood were needed and that it had to be fresh, preferably still warm from the body. This realization marked her transition from sadistic noble to methodical killer. She began selecting victims from among the youngest and most beautiful servants, believing that their youth could somehow be transferred to her through their life essence. To help her implement these increasingly elaborate schemes, Vladana assembled a circle of accomplices who became extensions of her twisted will. Magda Corvina was an elderly woman who served as both advisor and practitioner of folk magic, teaching Vladana rituals that blended superstition with genuine psychological manipulation. Pavel Sturm, a dwarf who had served as castle executioner, brought technical expertise in the art of causing death. Elena Vasquez procured new victims by recruiting servant girls from surrounding villages, with promises of good wages and comfortable positions. Stefan Mora handled the disposal of bodies with the efficiency of someone who had long since abandoned any connection to human feeling. Together, this group developed what could only be described as a system of murder that operated with terrifying efficiency. Victims were selected based on youth and beauty, lured to isolated chambers, and killed through methods designed to preserve as much blood as possible. Some were suspended from ceiling beams and bled slowly into silver basins below. Others were cut systematically while still alive, their terror supposedly purifying their blood and making it more potent for Vladana's rituals. The castle itself became a charnel house, where the smell of death permeated every stone corridor despite burning incense and herbs meant to mask the odor. Bodies were disposed of through multiple channels, some buried in the castle grounds, others fed to animals, still others thrown into the rushing mountain streams that carried them far from any possibility of discovery. The efficiency of this operation allowed the killing to continue for nearly 8 years. Without official intervention, by 1606, Vladana had killed dozens of servant girls, but the woman who stared back at her from her ornate mirrors showed no sign of the eternal youth she desperately sought. Time continued its inexorable march across her features, and her obsession deepened into complete madness. She became convinced that peasant blood was too weak, too diluted by common breeding to provide the rejuvenation she needed. Her attention turned to victims of noble birth, young women whose supposedly superior bloodlines might finally grant her the immortality she craved. This change in victim selection would prove to be her undoing, but Vladana was too deep in her delusions to recognize the danger. She began inviting young noble women to the castle, under pretense of finishing their education or learning the arts of household management. Unlike peasant servants, these girls had families who would miss them, who possessed the political connections necessary to demand answers from authorities, who might otherwise look the other way. The first noble victim was Sophia Brennan, a 16-year-old girl sent by her parents to learn court etiquette. Her family received carefully forged letters describing her contentment and progress. But when Sophia failed to return home as promised, her father arrived at the castle demanding explanations. Vladana received him graciously, expressing surprise and concern about the girl's disappearance. But the visiting nobleman noticed details that chilled him to the bone. Vladana was wearing Sophia's distinctive ruby necklace, a family heirloom that had been in the Brennan house for generations. Word spread quickly through the interconnected web of noble families that young women sent to Castle Dracul had an alarming tendency to vanish without explanation. Parents began refusing Vladana's invitations, and those few who still trusted her reputation insisted on frequent visits and regular correspondence. The isolation that had once protected her crimes now worked against her, as suspicious families shared their concerns and began documenting the pattern of disappearances. The investigation that would finally bring down Vladana Dracul began when King Ferdinand of Hungary decided to look into reports of missing noblewomen, partly motivated by genuine concern and partly by the opportunity to seize the vast Dracul estates. The king appointed Count Matthias Hunyadi to conduct a thorough investigation. Hunyadi was a methodical man who understood that accusations against someone of Vladana's status required overwhelming evidence. The investigation took months as Hunyadi carefully interviewed families of missing women, collected testimony from former servants who had escaped the castle, and documented physical evidence of the crimes. The picture that emerged was so horrific that even experienced officials found it difficult to believe. According to witness statements, Vladana had killed between 60 and 300 young women over the course of her murderous career, with the exact number likely never to be known, since many victims were peasants whose disappearance had never been officially recorded. On December 15, 1610, Hunyadi arrived at Castle Dracul with a contingent of soldiers and a royal warrant for Vladana's arrest. What they discovered inside the castle would haunt the investigators for the rest of their lives. The raid began at dawn, when thick morning mist still shrouded the mountain peaks, providing cover for their approach while ensuring sufficient daylight to document their findings. The first indication of the horrors within came from the smell that hit them as soon as they entered the main hall. The unmistakable odor of death, so thick and cloying that several soldiers had to step outside to vomit before continuing. Following this scent deeper into the castle's lower levels, they discovered chambers that defied description. One room contained the bodies of 3 young women who had been tortured to death so recently that rigor mortis had not yet set in. Another held partially dismembered remains arranged in patterns that suggested ritual significance. The most shocking discovery was in Vladana's private chambers, where investigators found her personal bathing tub filled with what appeared to be human blood. The liquid was still warm, and floating in it were chunks of flesh and human hair that later analysis would identify as belonging to multiple victims. Vladana herself was found nearby, her body covered in blood that clearly wasn't her own, muttering incoherently about the approaching restoration of her youth. Among the evidence collected was Vladana's personal diary, written in her own hand, and documenting her crimes in meticulous detail. The entries read like the fevered dreams of someone completely detached from reality, describing her theories about blood's rejuvenating properties and her experiments with different methods of extraction. Some passages were so disturbing that they were immediately sealed and never released to the public, though their contents became the subject of whispered speculation throughout Europe. The investigation also uncovered the bodies of several young, noble women who had been reported missing over previous months. Their remains showed evidence of prolonged torture, and the condition of their bodies suggested they had been kept alive for days or even weeks before finally being allowed to die. The systematic nature of these crimes, combined with the sheer number of victims, painted a picture of evil on a scale that shocked the civilized world. Vladana herself never faced formal trial. As a member of the high nobility, she was technically beyond the reach of conventional justice, and King Ferdinand was reluctant to set a precedent that might someday be used against other noble families. Instead, she was placed under house arrest. While her accomplices faced trial for their crimes, the proceedings against Magda, Pavel, Elena, and Stefan began in early 1611 and quickly became a sensation throughout Europe. The prosecutors presented evidence that revealed the inner workings of Vladana's murder machine in horrific detail. Witness after witness testified about the systematic nature of the crimes, the careful selection of victims, and the elaborate rituals that surrounded each killing. Former servants described being forced to watch as their fellow workers were tortured to death. Local peasants told of finding body parts in the forests surrounding the castle. Officials admitted to accepting bribes to ignore reports of missing women. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the certainty of execution, the accomplices began turning against each other in desperate attempts to minimize their own roles while implicating their former partners. Their confessions provided investigators with a complete picture of how the operation had functioned, from victim selection to body disposal. All four accomplices were found guilty and sentenced to death, though their executions were carried out in different ways based on their perceived levels of culpability. Magda, deemed the primary instigator after Vladana herself, was burned at the stake. Pavel was beheaded as befitted his role as executioner. Elena and Stefan were hanged, their bodies left displayed as warnings to others who might consider similar crimes. While her accomplices faced justice, Vladana remained confined to her castle, officially under investigation, but effectively beyond the reach of law. King Ferdinand and his advisors debated for months about her fate. Execution was legally impossible given her noble status, but allowing her freedom was politically unthinkable given the scale of her crimes. The solution they finally implemented was as cruel as it was creative. Vladana would be walled up alive in her own castle, confined to a small set of rooms with no possibility of escape or contact with the outside world except through her guards. The imprisonment took place in late 1611, nearly a year after her arrest. She was sealed into 3 rooms in the castle's highest tower, a bedroom, a small sitting area, and a prayer chamber. The doorways were bricked up, leaving only small openings for food delivery and waste removal. The windows were barred and shuttered, cutting off any view of the world beyond her prison. Contemporary accounts describe Vladana's initial reaction to her confinement as a mixture of rage and disbelief. She had apparently convinced herself that her noble status would ultimately protect her from serious consequences, and the reality of permanent imprisonment came as a devastating shock. She spent her first months alternately pleading with guards and threatening them with dire consequences when she was inevitably freed. As months turned to years, however, Vladana's defiance gave way to a kind of resigned madness that may have been more disturbing than her earlier rage. Guards reported hearing her conducting lengthy conversations with invisible presences, sometimes arguing with voices only she could hear, sometimes reciting what sounded like incantations or prayers in languages they didn't recognize. She occasionally claimed to see the ghosts of her victims, describing their appearances in vivid detail to anyone who would listen. The woman who had killed hundreds in a futile attempt to preserve her youth was now trapped in a situation where she would age and deteriorate without anyone to witness her decline except the guards who brought her meals. The vanity that had driven her to murder was being punished in the most fitting way imaginable. As she watched her reflection change in the small mirror that had been one of her few allowed possessions, Vladana's physical health deteriorated rapidly. Under the conditions of her imprisonment, the lack of sunlight and exercise, combined with a diet of simple prison fare, took a severe toll on a woman who had once lived in absolute luxury. Her famous beauty faded completely, replaced by the haggard appearance of someone who had lost all hope and all connection to the world. Beyond her stone walls, Perhaps the cruelest aspect of her punishment was the silence that surrounded her. Vladana, who had once commanded dozens of servants and held the power of life and death over hundreds, now had virtually no human contact beyond the minimal interactions with guards who delivered her food. The woman who had been surrounded by the screams of her victims now lived in a world where the only sounds were her own voice and the occasional footsteps of her jailers. On September 3, 1614, guards arriving with Vladana's morning meal found her dead in her bed. She was 43 years old and appeared to have died peacefully in her sleep, a mercy she had never granted to any of her victims. The official cause of death was listed as natural causes, though some contemporary observers suspected suicide. Her body showed no signs of violence, and there were no indications she had been poisoned or harmed by her guards. The death of Vladana Dracul did not end her story, but rather began its transformation from historical fact into enduring legend. Her crimes were so shocking, so far beyond normal human evil, that they quickly transcended mere documentation and entered the realm of myth and folklore. Her body was initially buried in the castle chapel, but local residents complained that her presence was desecrating holy ground. She was eventually moved to an unmarked grave in a distant cemetery, but the location was kept secret to prevent it from becoming a site of morbid fascination. The psychological profile that emerges from historical records suggests a woman who suffered from what modern psychiatry would recognize as severe personality disorders. Her complete lack of empathy, her grandiose sense of self-importance, her need for absolute control, and her willingness to inflict suffering for personal gratification all point to psychopathic tendencies that were exacerbated by her social position and family history. But Vladana was also a product of her time and class, created by a system that granted absolute power to nobles, while offering no protection to those beneath them. The feudal structure that gave her authority over hundreds of people also insulated her from consequences for most of her murderous career. She faced no oversight, no questioning, no accountability until her crimes became so extreme that they could no longer be ignored. The story of Vladana Dracul serves as a chilling reminder that evil rarely announces itself with obvious signs. It can emerge from privilege, hide behind respectability, and operate within civilized society for years before being exposed. The combination of power, isolation, and mental illness that created the Blood Countess continues to produce monsters in every generation, reminding us that the capacity for such evil exists as a dark potential within human nature itself.